teaching. A couple of decades ago, well, several decades ago, there was a clock in the back of the classroom. And I covered it up with a sign. At first, I put a sign on it that said, "Time will pass, will you?" Hoping that students would spend a little more time focusing on the subject than how soon the passing period was coming. But then after a little bit, I changed the sign to read in a circular fashion. The words were, "Listen to learn, learn to listen, listen to learn to listen, listen to learn." So that wherever you came into the circle, you came into some sort of wisdom. You've probably seen the movie in one iteration or another, one of its many generations. Do it with me if you can. Ready? Wax on, wax off, wax on, wax off. Poor little Daniel never did quite get it. But a lot of people mistake that movie. They think it's a movie about martial arts, or some people think it's a movie about, it's not even a story about clash of cultures. It's really a story about teaching and a story about learning. I remember when I first came to Westmont Chapel. It was the first time I'd been on Westmont's campus, and I was a little nervous, a little unsettled, quite expectant. I was interviewing for the Adams Chair of Music and Worship, and I walked into chapel, and the greeters were there, as they were today for the first time this semester. Thank you, greeters. And they were all bubbly and happy and said, oh, apparently they kind of figured out I was a visitor, and they said, "Welcome to chapel. Our campus pastor is speaking today." And there was just such this great sense of excitement and anticipation and pride of community that they were just blessed with a pastor they cared about and who cared for them. And then I remember when Dr. Beebe first came, and I was walking up the hill after one of Dr. Beebe's deeply thoughtful chapels before he got his new vibe. And and the student I was walking with was kind of a little glazed in the eyes and said, "Is chapel always like that? I mean, does he think we're all scholars or something?" I think so. Well, the readings we encountered this morning were all about teaching and learning. And I want to share with you this morning an encouragement about learning, about how to learn, about the appreciation of learning, not just learning, but teaching too. And not just the kind of learning or the kind of teaching that you think you like right now, but kinds of learning that might be troubling to you, different forms. And I'd like to give that encouragement so that you appreciate as many of them as possible. Because combined, all those kinds of learning will enable you to be successful in the field of endeavor that you've chosen to win your daily bread. And when you get involved in that field, will enable you to share the living bread with those who you come in contact with. Learn how to listen, listen to learn to listen, learn how to learn, learn. It's all cycles. Each semester, we faculty members get in the cycle. We get to read our student evaluations from the previous year. Sometimes those are just really affirming comments on the brilliant Socratic discussions that we've engaged you in. And sometimes they're stunning revelations that people have from senior seminars. And sometimes they're a little troubling. We read stories of students who are upset with our teaching techniques or the demands that we've made of reading and writing. And we hope that those complaints turn into discoveries later on of how important the rigor of your study was, or how you finally get it, the methods that we were using. Well, sometimes that happens. But I often also wonder about the student that doesn't quite get it, who I might leave behind, or who doesn't come into the fold of learning. And I think about the teachers that I've had, the great ones, and the really bad ones. And I think about the great teachers of all time, and maybe the greatest teacher of all time. And I wonder what would have happened if they'd had student evaluations. Because you see, in my time, and in the time before that, students get to fill out those forms at the end of every semester. So I wonder if Mr. Fossey had any clue how much I loved the 5th grade. It's just the best time. Or if Mrs. Glick ever gave passing thought to the fact that I almost dropped out of school after the 6th grade. But probably not. So to make up for that previous lack, I've drawn up a list of student evaluation comments that might have been apropos for, well, who I would consider the greatest teacher of all time. And I offer these to you and to my colleagues as an encouragement also when they read theirs. Here's some that came to mind to me. Never handed out a clear syllabus. Test questions were obscure. Was overly authoritative. Didn't consider student viewpoints as valid as his. Thought he was always right. Never used PowerPoint. Could have used more films. Didn't provide us with lecture outlines. Required way too much reading and quoted from too many old books and lectures. No up-to-date reading materials. Assumed we knew a lot of background material for a required first-year course. Pop quizzes counted for too much. I didn't understand the grading system. Played favorites. Had an inner circle of students that got special attention. Didn't have regular office hours. Needs to grade on a curve. And finally, I didn't like his lecture style. Too many parables. So what do we learn from this greatest teacher or rabbi of all time? Well, the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John says that we learn the path to everlasting life. But if Jesus is the greatest teacher, why do his students do so poorly on the tests? Why don't they understand the lectures? What's the point of all the parables if they have to stay after class to ask the meaning? Surely there's a summary on Wikipedia. But I think maybe it's a different equation. It's not about the parable or the instructor or the syllabus, but it's about you, the learner. Sure, you can learn facts and figures, and you can learn pitches and rhythms, but those are only tools for us to unlock the truths that are hidden in the syllabus. It's often the struggle, the process of learning that awakes the curiosity, that causes the discovery. It's through the confusion or frustration that's the crucible, the refiner's fire, to get us to real understanding and real use of the material that we're struggling with. Jesus knew his students didn't get it right away, that he had to explain, even to his best and brightest. And he also knew that they wouldn't get it while he was with them completely on earth. That some of these things would just have to percolate, they'd have to stew, so that they would reveal truth well after the end of the term. One great discovery that we can make is that we all learn differently, and that's one of the reasons why a liberal arts place is so great. You're not in with just chemists or just musicians or just artists, but you hear the views into the world from others. Imagine that parable of the prodigal son. You can learn so many things from it depending upon your point of view, your perspective. You can learn about grace, you can learn about forgiveness, you can learn about selfishness, you can learn the story of the prodigal. You can learn the story of the older son. You can learn the story of the father. You can learn stories of the world and its temptations. Lots of things depending on your point of view. Point of view is one thing Leonardo da Vinci used in his great painting of the Last Supper that you may have seen. Da Vinci painted this in the 15th century. He put it on the wall of the cafeteria, much like the DC, in a nunnery. Now we have those video screens. Perhaps they're an improvement, perhaps not. But I think we have somewhere a PowerPoint that has that picture on it. There it is, good. Yeah. There's Da Vinci's telling his parable of a story, of a moment in the life of Jesus. And depending on who you are, you might learn something different from this. If you're an art major, you might just marvel at Da Vinci's use of perspective, that brand new idea in the 15th century, where everything is drawn up into the center, and the center of the picture, the head, is Jesus' head. And we're all drawn by that, from light and line, all to that moment. If you're an RS major, you might sort of really wonder at Da Vinci's exegesis of the characters in this story. Oh, there's Simon Peter over on the far right. He's kind of explaining to the other disciples, what's Jesus talking about? And Peter's trying to tell them, well, it's like this. Or maybe you're looking over there on the left and you see the one character with a little bag in his hand, Judas, covering over his coins, being concerned about the finances. Maybe you're a chemistry major and you're kind of worried about why it's faded so badly and what's going on. And you dig in and you discover that Da Vinci was experimenting with new pigments and new methods of plastering them on walls and frescoes. And it didn't work very well. And the painting is fading over time, and maybe you're the one that's going to discover the new pigmentation or a restorative technique to let that painting last another 500 years in the culture that we share together. Or maybe you're a music major and, oh golly, an Agnus Dei jumps to mind. That moment in the communion liturgy where we sing of the Lamb of God and you sense the serenity of that first celebration of the breaking of bread. Or maybe you're a pre-med student studying anatomy and you wonder why everybody has feet except Jesus. And you do a little research and you discover that about 100 years after he painted it, the food service director thought that the cafeteria needed a new door, and so he chiseled right through the bottom of the painting. Well, nothing is sacred, apparently, and that's what we lost when they chiseled through the bottom of the Da Vinci. So, if we don't think of ways into the painting, all we see is a faded old painting with a confused dinner party where for some reason everybody's sitting on the same side of the table. What's that about? Your learning is about your discovery, your point of view, your research, your involvement with others who see different things, and then great learning happens. But how do you learn? Do you have the tenacity to stick to it, to dig into the meaning and purpose of a subject? Or are you content with the facts and the GPA? Are you stuck with one learning style? I want to share with you this morning a parable that I lived through. Well, I'll call it the anonymous autobiographical story of Russian history. And we'll call the professor involved Dr. John. The story, it seems, is about a young music student who, in his third year in college, only had one room for an elective. And so he chose a course in his next favorite field of study, which was history. And there was only one offered at the time of day that was convenient, so he just signed up, somehow got in, even though there were lots of prerequisites for the course. It was an upper division course in medieval Russian history. And on the first day of class, it was discovered that there was only one non-history major in the room. And a few moments later, it was discovered there was only one student who hadn't had at least a year of Russian language study. And then it was discovered just shortly thereafter that there was only one student in the room that hadn't had the 3 or 4 basic history courses that were required to be in that classroom. But what the heck, it sounded interesting. Well, that first weekend of school, the choir retreat bus, that student didn't spend his time playing cards in the back of the bus with his friends. He spent the time up front trying to shut all the noise out while he transliterated the entire Russian alphabet from Cyrillic for the first time and tried to identify all those spots of geography, cities, towns, points of interest on the ancient map of 12th century Russia. Well, then there was reading, and there was that book by Florinsky that talked so deeply and so passionately and so opinionatedly about Russian history. And it was hard to grapple with and hard to grasp. And the notes that came home from class were sort of half written in phonetic Russian or some feeble attempt at the same. And it came about to the third week of class and that first test. And what seemed so interesting seemed like folly. And that single essay question, support Florinsky's assertion that ancient Russia was a Mongol, big M, like Mongolia, Mongol state. Well, the music student really couldn't. Was confused by Florinsky's assertions, and some of the optional parallel readings had disagreed with Florinsky. So what was one to think? But sitting there in that precious hour of discernment, the reckless academician purged forward, thinking, oh, hang the GPA, just go for it, and wrote a rather emotional appeal of how Florinsky was wrong, that the indigenous people still had culture, and that there were other invaders. There were the Swedes, and there were the Bulgarians, and the Poles, and it wasn't just the Mongols, and turned the paper in. Well, the next class period, the papers came back, and the history majors in the room sort of opened the cover of the test book, and a lot of them slid into their backpacks, and a lot of downcast eyes. And the music major looked at that paper, and inside the fold, and that big red A-. Good original thinking. Support your argument more fully next time. This is getting interesting. And so it came time for the term paper. And Dr. John said, write on whatever you want that relates to medieval Russian history. Oh boy. So after some investigation, the music major decided to write on ancient Russian Znameny liturgical chant. Especially when Dr. John said, that sounds like a good topic. I don't know much about it. Clear sailing. So after lots of hours in the library, lots of reading, in fact, almost being late to choir a few times, down deep in the bowels of the library, researching ancient books on Russian music, the music major thought he had a pretty good paper to turn in. Well, a week after those rough drafts were turned in, that ominous compliment rested across the top of the paper in red ink. Nice start. And the next 20 pages were laced with marginal red notes and crossouts and ideas. And at the very bottom, Dr. John had written, "Come by my office to see the books, the liturgical notation books of chant that I have in manuscript and the recordings I have from the monasteries. I think it'll help you understand your subject." Dr. John's little knowledge far exceeded several weeks of library research. And so back to the library and back to the writing in another attempt. And finally, that final exam came. The final exam came, and Dr. John walked into the room with a briefcase bulging with exam papers and put his briefcase down on the desk at the front of the room and opened it and looked out at the eager scholars waiting to receive it, many of them nervous, all of them nervous, and paused for a minute, then closed the briefcase, picked it back up, looked at the scholars and said, "No, it won't do any good. You've all failed, and this test won't help you pass," and walked out. Well, one by one, people walked out, picked up their backpacks, and shuffled away, until there were about 6 people in the room. They began to talk and said, "Does that make any sense? I mean, I passed the tests, and I got a good grade on my term paper, and I was active in class discussion. This just doesn't add up." So the 6 of them purposed to go visit Dr. John in his office. So they got up, they left, and they walked down the stairs to the next floor and around the corner to where the little parlor was in front of the faculty offices. And there was Dr. John sitting, reading a Russian history newspaper, or a Russian newspaper. And in front of him was a beautiful Russian tea set with 7 cups and saucers. And he looked up and said, "6. Just about what I thought. You passed the test." And we sat and talked about Russian history for the next hour or so. Dr. John didn't want us to get the answer right. He didn't want the obvious answer. He didn't want his students to be satisfied with the rough draft. He wanted his students to do what the people of Russia in that era couldn't do, to think freely, to question authority. He wanted them to support their argument, to self-examine, to ask why, and to push back a little bit. Not that they got the right answer in the text. In fact, he revealed to us that he picked Florinsky because it was his least favorite textbook on Russian history. That student only saw Dr. John once in the rest of his time in college. You saw him right before graduation at the mailboxes in the Student Center. And Dr. John said, "Good to see you again. What are you going to be doing after graduation?" The student said with kind of a glowy bright eye, "I'm going to be a teacher." And Dr. John said, "I'm so sorry, you'll hate it." And walked away. You had to dig deep and take risks to see what Dr. John wanted you to see, and listen closely to hear the lesson beneath the lecture. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. Perhaps the kingdom of God, at least for scholars, is like a Russian history class that makes you dig for answers, rewrite term papers, and come prepared for the final exam, so that when you come to take it, you are welcomed as at a tea party in the parlor of the professor. When I began teaching several decades ago, there was a clock in the back of the classroom. And at first I covered it up with a sign that said, "Time will pass, will you?" And then after a time I covered it over with a different saying that said, "Learn to listen. Listen to learn." So that wherever you came into the circle, you encountered something of wisdom.